Hello, I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this second teach-in on the situation in Ukraine. I think all of us recognize that the war in Ukraine is escalating day by day. I'm talking to you in January of 2023. Today, they announced that various countries in Europe are sending tanks to the Ukrainians as they continue to wage war against the Russians, backed up now by over $112 billion in aid that is coming from the United States. The Russians, meanwhile, have fortified what they've taken as they have secured a land bridge between Russia to Crimea to ensure that they have access to the Black Sea, with several 100,000 more troops. So the irresistible force of US and NATO expansion to the east has met with the immovable object of Russian nationalism. Both sides have talked about the use of nuclear weapons. The United States has always had a first strike nuclear capacity and doctrine. The Russians have said very clearly that they will use nuclear weapons to defend the land bridge to Crimea that they have taken. And so it looks like the world, as we open up this year of 2023 with concurrent escalations in the climate turbulence all around the world, rather than coming together to deal with critical issues of existential concern, is choosing to wage war in Central Europe, and doing so in a way that, in all likelihood, if we do not stop this momentum and have an immediate ceasefire and a summit of all parties so that diplomacy can have an opportunity to work, we're all likely to face a nuclear exchange in Central Europe, perhaps more broadly, as the war continues. In my first teach-in, I basically dealt with the issue of the geostrategic balance of power and why it was that the Russians invaded Ukraine against the backdrop of US expansion of NATO to the east, in violation of the agreement that was made with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, in the 1980s. I'd like to just very briefly summarize that. And today I want to really look at the issue of empathy in relationship to hatred, and look more deeply at some of the solutions that could very naturally emerge from this critical situation that would bring about peace. And again, I'm going to just quickly share a few maps so we all understand what has been taking place. This is the map of Europe in 1990, when Gorbachev had proposed to the Americans and the British and the Germans. At that time, West Germany was divided from East Germany, and also NATO, saying that the Cold War, which had kept the balance of power between these two titans, these two empires, the American Empire and the Russian Empire, had kept a basic stability from 1945 to 1985, about 40 years, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He understood that Poland and East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, which were part of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, were intent on gaining their own independence. It was Gorbachev who withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan as soon as he came in 1985. And he understood that even though the Soviets had taken control over Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, after Germany in 1941 had invaded the Soviet Union, and as a result of which between 20 and 30 million, most estimates now settle around 27 million Soviets were killed, and millions more were made homeless and refugees, and all kinds of destruction ensued. That when the Germans were defeated, the Soviets, as they pushed Germany out of Eastern Europe, consolidated control for a buffer zone, so that any further rearmament of Germany would have much more difficulty attacking the Russian heartland. This agreement and this suzerainty over Eastern Europe was codified in 1945 in Yalta, right after the war, with Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt. Germany was divided into 4 zones initially: the Americans, the French, the British, and the Russians. And Gorbachev basically said the Cold War was over, and that the Soviet Union was willing to withdraw from Eastern Europe, allow Germany to be reunited, if the United States and NATO would agree not to move, as Secretary of State James Baker put it, not 1 inch to the east. And on that basis, the Soviets withdrew their forces. The Warsaw Treaty Organization was disbanded. And in fact, Gorbachev worked with the Poles and other Eastern European countries to begin the process of independent existing. 25 years later, in 2015, this is the map of Europe. This is what we have currently today. The United States broke the agreement that was forged with Gorbachev, and on the basis of which the Soviets withdrew from all this territory and pushed NATO to the east. Here's where Ukraine is. This is Belarus. And to get a better sense of what that looks like, here's Russia. Here's Ukraine. It's easily the largest country in Europe. It's the breadbasket of Europe. And in 2008, in a conference of NATO in Bucharest, Romania, the United States announced that Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia were going to be next, as NATO continued over Russian objections to move to the east. And at that time, in May of 2008, after the announcement, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, said unequivocally that this was a red line, this was an existential threat, and that if the United States and NATO pushed into Ukraine, Russia would be forced to retake Crimea, which it had had since 1783 and Catherine the Great until the First World War, and then with the vicissitudes of the establishment of the Soviet Union and then World War II, the Soviet Union borders were recalibrated. But Russia has always, as a great power, as the largest country in the world, needed access to the Black Sea so it could get to the Mediterranean and out to the Atlantic. So Crimea and a land bridge to Russia is essentially what the Russians felt in the face of NATO encroachment they would have to have. I detailed the events from 2008 to 2022 when the Russians invaded, but essentially what has happened. And this is very important for people to understand. Russia has not invaded Ukraine has not invaded Ukraine to take over Ukraine. It has not been bent on a greater Russian expansion into Eastern Europe, with Vladimir Putin having delusions of grandeur to reconstitute the Soviet Union. What it has done, very simply, in the face of US, NATO expansion, is secure its land bridge to Crimea. That's it. That's all. And it's not going to give this up. And everyone needs to be crystal clear about this. The Russians, Vladimir Putin, are not going to give the land that they've taken up. And they've made it very clear that they will use nuclear weapons if necessary to protect what they've taken as a land bridge to Crimea. So that's very important for people to understand. And the populations here are 80, 90% Russian. They've supported the annexation by Russia into Russia. Obviously, it's been under the turbulence of war and so forth. But what has happened in the last year has been a very specific and minimal acquisition of territory that the Russians feel that they must have as a great power in order to counter the eastward expansion of an aggressive military alliance headed by the United States, armed with nuclear weapons right at the Russian border, with an ultimate strategic objective of not only taking Ukraine, but breaking Russia up. How many times have you heard about regime change in Russia? So what's happening in Ukraine now is not the end game. This is just one installment in a larger strategy by the United States that has been articulated by the neoconservatives since the 1990s. That they would like to see the breakup of Russia. You can see maps where Russia is broken up into 4 or 5 smaller countries. And the Russians understand that. And they've said very clearly that that's not going to happen. So that's where we are in Ukraine. What I would like to talk about today in this second teaching is how we are so easily manipulated to hate. Just think of what you may feel about the Russians, what you feel about Vladimir Putin. Most people I meet hate the Russians. And for Vladimir Putin, he's considered a Hitler figure, a satanic figure, bent on world conquest, and we have to stop him at all costs. This is the playbook of the US military industrial complex: to create an enemy, demonize the enemy, craft what's going on as a human rights, civil liberties issue, and then foment war. This happened in Vietnam when I was young. Ho Chi Minh was the Hitler-esque figure in those days. The North Vietnamese were, like the Russians today, bent on conquest of all of Asia. And the United States had to defend South Vietnam against the onslaught of world communism. We all know now that that was untrue. We also know that the United States manufactured the incidences like the Gulf of Tonkin incidents in 1965 that were used as false flag operations and then blamed on the North Vietnamese to justify the United States sending upwards of 500,000 troops to Southeast Asia and specifically to Vietnam. We obviously lost that war because it was not only morally untenable, but in that time, the North Vietnamese and their allies in South Vietnam proved adroit and skillful in defeating the United States until finally in 1973, the United States withdrew with ignominy from Vietnam. We saw the same playbook in Iraq in 2001, 2002, 2003, as in the aftermath of 9/11. The neoconservatives decided it would be a good idea to invade Iraq. They manufactured the same playbook. Saddam Hussein was the great enemy. He was a Hitler-like figure, guilty of all kinds of atrocities. You may remember the one atrocity that really galvanized the kind of hatred and anger in the American public and even in the European public, were pictures of his soldiers going into a hospital to the ward of the newly born babies and killing babies, and people were filled with revulsion. Turned out that the entire atrocity was manufactured. It wasn't true. It was false flag. And yet it was used to foment the level of hatred required for the public to endorse a war that had no legitimate reason. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And yet the US went to war. And it's worth pointing out, as we consider what we feel about the Russians, is that since 1989, the United States has invaded and used military force against 9 different countries: Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, to name only a few, and have dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs and ordinances so extensively that it's been on the average of 24,000 bombs every 24 hours since 1989. That's been the destructive power that the United States has rained down on 9 different countries. And while they've been doing that, they've been pushing NATO to the east. Until finally, and this is the first point that I want to make, is that if you remember reading 1984 by George Orwell, he talks about the fact that to mobilize for war, the government needs to control the media and foment hate. And those of you who've read the book know that there was a ministry of peace, which was really about waging war. There was a ministry of truth, which was really about manufacturing falsehood. And they would work up the hatred through the propaganda because you didn't receive any other kind of information on the mass media, until finally the people were so full of hate, they would have to have regular hate sessions where for 2 minutes a day, people would get up in front of the TV and they put a picture of the enemy, Goldstein, if you remember, on the screen, and people would shout and curse and just release venom against that. And once it was released, people would settle down. But that was how they kept the population motivated to support war. And that's what's happening now with Ukraine. Every day, there are tales of the atrocities of the Russians. There's depictions of the demonic Vladimir Putin and the devastation that's happening against the Russians. And I just encourage all of you, even if you believe it to be true, to just start to consciously be aware of how the mass media is encouraging you to hate Russia, and in particular, to hate Vladimir Putin. When the reality is actually, like it was in Vietnam, like it was in Iraq, like it was in Afghanistan, like it was in Libya, is exactly the reverse. If Vladimir Putin did not, in the face of this level of aggression from the other superpower, take some action to protect Russia's access to the Black Sea, he would probably be impeached by the Russian parliament. He would be removed from office, as any leader would be. And if all of us just for a moment would open our hearts to an empathetic understanding of how the world looks from the Russian point of view, we would go a long way to breaking the hold that the mass media and our governments have over us as they foment war, because it is the same people and the same ideology of neoconservatism in the United States that brought us Iraq, brought us Afghanistan, has brought us the 9 wars that the US has waged, and is now conjuring up war in Ukraine. The difference between Ukraine and all the other wars that the United States has waged since 1989, 1990, is that the other 9 countries had no capacity to really fight the United States. Iraq had no capacity to withstand the shock and awe that was rained down upon them by the US military. Libya, the Balkans, Afghanistan. Russia in Ukraine is a completely different story. We're dealing here with the other superpower, the largest country in the world by several levels of reality. The United States, as large as it is, China, as large as it is, Canada, as large as it is, would fit several times into what is now Russia, that spans 11 time zones. It's the wealthiest country in the world by far in terms of natural resources. It has been a great power for 300 years. It's armed like the United States is with nuclear weapons, and has weapon systems that in some cases, like its hypersonics weapons, that are equal to or even superior to what the United States has. So when you're dealing with Russia, you're not dealing with Iraq. You're dealing with the other imperium that has been standing for a very long time. And the Russians, after being invaded by the French in 1812 by Napoleon, invaded by the Germans in 1941 under Hitler, and now being pressed as the United States moves to the east through NATO with a view of breaking up Russia. The Russians have been through this before. They know how to endure. They know how to survive. And that's why the prospect of nuclear war is so real, and why I'm speaking out on this issue, and why, with Humanity Rising, we're convening a summit on Ukraine, February 27th through the 3rd of March, to commemorate the first year anniversary of the war, and then again in April, between the 24th and the 27th of April, and then again in June. Because as long as this war endures and escalates, the risk of nuclear exchange increases. And because the Russians are not going to withdraw from what they've taken. And everybody needs to be clear about that. What needs to happen is the United States needs to stand down. Because as I indicated by just looking at the map, had the United States not pushed NATO to the east, there would have been no war in Ukraine. And that's why I consider the U.S. expansion of NATO to the east to be the single greatest strategic blunder in U.S. history, certainly the greatest blunder since the end of the Cold War. Just imagine what would have happened had the United States worked with the Russians to create what Gorbachev proposed. And that is a single economic and security zone. Because as he said repeatedly, the security of one is the security of all. So it's in that spirit that I would like to turn to the main issue of how do we solve this thing? What do we actually do? And it's in the spirit of empathy that I want to lay out the vision. I touched on it in my first teaching, but I want to go more deeply to say that the empathy with the Russians is to open our hearts to love the Russians like we love the Ukrainians. Can you do that? Can we open our hearts to the Russians and understand their point of view like we're understanding the point of view of Ukraine? I've spoken about empathy to the Russians. We need to have empathy with the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are a very special people. I've traveled in Ukraine. I studied in Ukraine during the days when I was working with Mikhail Gorbachev and so forth. I had a lot of Ukrainian friends. Ukraine, arguably, is the Sacred Heart of Europe. The word Ukraine means crossings, means border crossings. Ukraine is basically a vast plain, a vast steppe. And empires and peoples and tribes and nations have crisscrossed Ukraine since time immemorial. And that's why it never became an independent country until 1991. Ukraine, just so everybody knows, is one of the newest countries in the world. It's had a very long history as a crossroads, but it also developed over time its identity. Russia was born there, the Kingdom of Rus in the 9th century that controlled that whole area. The Poles have been there, the Lithuanians have been there, the Byzantines, the British, the French, people have fought over Crimea. The Russians have had it since 1783 Catherine the Great, and then it broke up again. And then finally in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, out pops Ukraine. We need to honor that. They need their sovereignty. Absolutely. But they need their sovereignty in a way that begins to model not the old mentality of hatred and combat, but models the kind of world and the kind of peace that all of us know is possible. And in envisioning empathetically what needs to happen as we understand that Russia has taken what it believes it needs to secure its access to the Black Sea. That leaves 80% of Ukraine, which still is by far the largest country in Europe. And often when countries emerge, the borders aren't stable. And what we're basically seeing, if you think about it in the largest historical context, is the final border disposition of the Second World War. Even more broadly, the First World War, and the Second World War, and then the Cold War. And then in the aftermath of the Cold War, the expansion of U.S. military control. What does the U.S. want? It wants complete control of Europe. And it has now seized complete control of Europe through NATO. And all the Europeans need to understand that. You are now, to all my European friends, I've lived in Europe. I love Europe. Europe is now a vassal to the United States. That's what's happening. And NATO is an instrument. The United States completely dominates NATO. And the United States has now consolidated economic and political control over all of Europe. Ukraine needs to be kept separate from U.S. military and economic control. Remember, it's the crossroads. It's the boundary area. It's where Russia started. It contributed mightily to the history of Western Europe and to Europe generally. It's the mother of Europe. And so the Ukrainians need their sovereignty. And in the spirit of Jean Monnet, the French diplomat who at the end of the Second World War, after 50 million people lay dead, and the carnage of the Second World War coming very quickly after the First World War, which killed 10 million people, had left Europe basically a smoldering ruin. Jean Monnet said to everyone, listen, we have to stop this madness. And why don't we start small? The Coal and Steel Commission, so that the Germans and the French, the principal protagonists of the Second World War, although there were others that came in, can start to work together as friends. And that's what we need to envision again with Ukraine. It may seem that the current conflict is irredeemable and that the hatred runs too deep. But we transitioned from our hatred of the Germans in the Second World War to now they're an ally of the United States. The United States and the Soviet Union and Russia before that, and now Russia again, have had many permutations of friendship and enmity and neutrality and collaboration and competition. It just depends on our consciousness. That as long as we're motivated by hate, we will sustain war. The moment we can open up our hearts to empathy, we can initiate peace. That's the law of history. And that's why I'm appealing to everyone to open their hearts to empathy and begin to look at the Russians and love the Russians like we all love the Ukrainians. If we can do that, peace will be at hand. and the power of the mass media to foment war through hatred will be broken. Just imagine, like the Coal and Steel Commission in Europe, Russia and Ukraine coming together. Russia has what it has. It's not going to give that up. Ukraine, what it has. It needs access to the Black Sea through Odessa. But just imagine a greater Ukrainian federation like the EU, let's say an EU 2.0, completely demilitarized, where the Ukrainians and the Russians work together as they've done for nearly a millennia, where all the weapons are left at the door. And Ukraine is understood as the center of Europe, the mother of Europe, and a place where peaceful coexistence can reign supreme as a model for how the East, the Russians, and the West, the United States, and Western Europe can come together in Eastern Europe in a new way, not through war and nuclear aggressiveness, but through common security. That's the vision that I believe we should be aspiring to, but it can only come through empathy and an open heart. I don't mean this in a airy-fairy way or that we're all going to sing Kumbaya. I mean it in a hard, realistic way, that we're confronted with the reality of a nuclear exchange. If we do not stop this war, we will enter the fires of Armageddon. We don't want that. We need to come together with the Russians, with the Chinese, with everybody to deal with actually the most critical issue in the world today, and that is runaway climate change. We are in code red. Climate disasters are breaking out all over the world more and more frequently as the ecology just begins to destabilize with an increasing turbulence that is shattering human infrastructures globally. And at this moment, we want to blow stuff up in Ukraine and create such enmity in the world that it is impossible to deal with climate change, when scientists are telling us our days are numbered to deal with climate change, or the human race and a million other species have an increasing possibility of going extinct. That's the real issue that we have to deal with. And in the face of that, like back 60 years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's clear the United States almost went to nuclear war over Cuba. Just imagine had President Kennedy listened to his generals and gone to nuclear war. We probably wouldn't even be here. Was Cuba worth the nuclear destruction of Europe and maybe most of the Eurasian landmass in the United States? No. One of the fundamental differences between the Cuban Missile Crisis and now is in that situation, the Soviet Union took nuclear weapons right to the gateway of the United States, 90 miles off the coast of Florida in Cuba. And the United States reacted as any great power would. And we almost went to nuclear exchange. This time, it's the United States that's bringing nuclear weapons and the NATO alliance in a highly aggressive way to the frontier, the border of Russia in Ukraine. And the Russians are reacting, as any great power would, to that threat. and are securing what they have to have for their national security. So the peace that we seek is actually in the map, on the ground, of the Russians taking what they've taken, the Ukrainians being honored as sovereign people and a sovereign nation for the first time in its very long history. It's the breadbasket of Europe. It's the largest country in Europe. It could be seen in the spirit of Jean Monnet as the crossroads for peaceful coexistence is the only modality of being for a new world. If we could do that out of the anvil, out of the ashes of this current war in Ukraine, we would seize the greatest opportunity out of the greatest crisis of our time. It's possible, everyone. What we need to initiate it is simply open hearts.